Hey, hello, MD Abdul Razzaq. How are you? Tomorrow is my exam. What exam? My master's midterm 1 exam on DSM 5101 risk assessment and vulnerability analysis, maybe the first course. All courses exams are done for midterm 1, but the first course has been delayed, and this is the last exam, which is the first course of this semester. So, as I have to practice my English speaking skills and also have to study, that's why I am making this video to help with my English speaking skills by practicing and speaking the English. By reading aloud, I will read a script, read the I will read the study materials which will help me tomorrow in my exams. So, in a proverb in Bengali, ek dhile dui pagi. I don't know the English proverb of that. That's why I'm making and doing this. So, good morning everyone. Today I will read this like a presentation. I have I make a script. Don't I make? I create a script from the chat GPT to be like a presentation that I will speak. So no more unnecessary talk. Let's go to the topics. Good morning everyone. Today I will present some fundamental concepts from the backbone of disaster management, particularly focusing on risk assessment and vulnerability analysis. So risk assessment and vulnerability analysis is the backbone, fundamental concepts that forms the backbone of disaster management. These concepts are essential for understanding how disasters occur and how we can mitigate the impact on society. Let's begin with the fundamental terms risk, hazard, exposure and vulnerability. These four terms is very important to understand any disastrous event. To manage a disaster properly, this is the core terms, basic terms, fundamental topics that need to be known before we have to make a community resilience. Okay. So let's begin with the fundamental terms risk, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Risk is defined as the probability of harmful consequences resulting from the interaction of a hazard with conditions of exposure and vulnerability. Risk is defined as the probability or harmful consequences resulting from the interaction of a hazard with conditions of exposure and vulnerability. In simple terms, risk it is the potential for loss of lives, assets or ecosystems due to a disaster. So risk is the potential for loss of lives, asset or ecosystem, any of loss that is caused by a disaster. That is a risk that will potentially lose something when a disaster happens. The formula often used to represent risk is risk is equal to hazard into exposure into vulnerability. Now, hazard. What is hazard? Hazard refers to an event, phenomenon, or human activity that can potentially cause harm. Potential is an important word. In risk, probability of harmful consequences when a disaster occur, and hazard refers to an event, phenomenon or human activity that can potentially cause harm. This can be categorized as natural hazards like earthquake, floods and cyclones, anthropogenic hazards such as industrial accidents, urban fires. How I am reading where I am so much low level student right now in English speakings that I can make a single sentence in my mind without reading the screen. How can I am saying? How am I saying and where I am reading from? Let's see. This is my PC. This is a desktop. I am reading from here. Okay. Let's continue. So, hazard refers to an event, phenomenon, or human activity that can potentially cause harm. This can be categorized as natural hazards, anthropogenic hazards, and combination of both. Natural hazards like earthquakes, floods, and cyclones, anthropogenic hazards like industrial accidents and urban fires, or a combination of both. For example, climate-induced disasters. Here, the natural hazard also work, and human-induced human makes the intensity of the disaster more significant, more high. Exposure. Exposure is the degree to which people, property, or critical infrastructure are located in hazard-prone areas. Exposure is the degree to which people, property, or critical infrastructure are located in hazard-prone areas. For instance, urban sprawl into floodplains increases exposure to flood hazards. High exposure amplifies the potential impact of a disaster. Of course, if I build a home near a river, then my exposure to a flood will increase. That's a simple. In a simple words, that's the matter. That's the fact. Okay, vulnerability. Vulnerability is the susceptibility. The word susceptibility are always. I am reading. I am learning. Whenever I want to learn vulnerability, the word susceptibility will come. Okay, vulnerability is the susceptibility of a community or system to affect the hazards. To the effect of hazards. Vulnerability is the susceptibility of a community or system to the effects of hazards. It depends on factors such as socioeconomic status, education, governance, physical infrastructure, and access to resources. Vulnerability is further divided into physical vulnerability, like weak buildings, social vulnerability, like marginalized communities, and economic vulnerability, like dependence on a single livelihood. Reducing vulnerability is key to minimizing risk. Next, let's explore the participatory approach in disaster management. This approach highlights the importance of engaging local communities in the process of disaster risk assessment, planning, and decision making. This approach highlights the importance of engaging local communities in the process of disaster risk assessment, planning, and decision making. It ensures that solutions are practical, sustainable, and inclusive. Why is this important? Why is this important? Because local communities are often the fast responders and possesses valuable indigenous knowledge. Valuable indigenous knowledge about hazards and vulnerabilities. Of course, they are facing the hazards, so they know the hazards very well. They know the techniques. They have some indigenous knowledge. How can they handle the situation? How can they tackle the situation? How to reduce the risk? How to reduce the loss? So, to make so the participatory approach is very important for local level. Okay, participatory tools include number 1, participatory mapping. Number 2, focus group discussions, FGD, which is a common terms used in many community-based works. Transect works. Okay, participatory mapping. Communities identify hazard-prone areas, critical resources, and safe zones using simple maps. First of all, we have to map. Focus group discussions. This enables diverse groups within the community to share their perceptions of risk and for possible solutions. That's a very important point. Transact works. I don't heard the word terms. Transact works. What? Field surveys with community members to identify vulnerabilities and capacities on the ground. That is called transact works. I know the concept, but I don't know the terms. Okay. By fostering ownership and collaboration, the participatory approach builds social capital and enhance long-term resilience. Finally, let's delve into the concept of coping capacity and adaptive capacity. Coping capacity refers to the ability of individuals, communities, or systems to manage adverse conditions during a disaster. Coping capacity refers to the ability of individuals, communities, or systems to manage adverse conditions during a disaster. Remember the word during. Coping capacity is always during. When a disaster happens, then what we do to cope up the situation, that is coping capacity. Okay, it is often reactive and focuses on short-term strategies. Yes, a disaster happening, I don't have enough time, so this is a short-term strategies. For example, temporary evacuation shelters, distributing relief materials, or using sandbags to prevent flooding are all coping mechanism. Of course, coping mechanism to cope up with the situation. Coping capacity is critical during the response and recovery phase. Response and recovery phase. A disaster is happened, we have to respond. How can we respond in a good manner to cope up with the situation to make our losses reduced? And in recovery phase, of course, we have to recover from the losses. This is critical. The coping capacity is critical during the response and recovery phase. Adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity, on the other hand, refers to the ability to adjust, modify, or transform to address future risks. It involves long-term proactive measures. So, coping capacity is reactive, immediate, short-term. Adaptive capacity is proactive, long-term measures that reduce vulnerability and exposure over time. Examples include building climate resilient infrastructure, adopting drought resilient crops, and implementing sustainable urban planning to mitigate flooding. Adaptive capacity is a key element of resilience because it enables systems to evolve and thrive despite changing risk patterns. If we always only follow to coping capacity, which is happens the most in Bangladesh, after a flood occurs, we all go to the disaster disaster zone to cope up with the situation, to help the victims. But in most cases, we don't follow adaptive capacity. We don't follow the, yes, we have some policy regulations, but that is not following properly. That's why the adaptive capacity is not properly maintaining. So the risk is, the event is occurring, and the losses of lives and property and resources are always. The difference between these two lies. The difference between these two lies in their scope and timelines. Coping capacity is about immediate response and survival during a disaster. Of course, when a disaster occurs, we have to think about its survival. We need to be alive. We don't have enough time. So, coping capacity is about immediate responses and survival during a disaster. Adaptive capacity focuses on long-term adjustments to reduce vulnerability and enhance preparedness for future hazards. In conclusion, these interrelated concepts, risk, hazard, vulnerability, exposure, participatory approaches, and the distinction between coping and adaptive capacities form the foundation of disaster management. By understanding these terms, we can better assess risks, engage communities, and develop strategies to minimize the impact of disasters while building sustainable resilience. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to address any questions or discuss further. Here I am a single person, single audience, single organizer, single speakers, everyone I am. So nobody will ask questions. Okay, that's enough for today. Allah Hafiz.